All right, thank you for that introduction. So I'm from UCD, is what I usually say when I introduce myself, but that could be a bit confusing over here, so I'm from UC Davis. And I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me to speak here. I'm going to talk today about where DNA information, also known as genomics in some circles, might generate value, and with a real focus on the commercial sector, given the audience that I'm going to be addressing today. And I just want to go through a few terminologies to make sure that we're synchronized between the two countries as to what I mean by various things. There's the seed stock sector, where we've got breeders that are breeding bulls to breed bulls or stud bulls, and then we've got the multiplier part of the seed stock sector that's producing stock bulls, I believe is the term I've heard used around the place. And then that goes into the commercial cow-calf sector, where all of the production animals are produced, then goes on to the feedlot and processor, which I think is also called the factory here, if I'm understanding correctly. And I'm going to go through the value propositions there and then finish up with a little bit of a futuristic look, a little bit maybe of a crazy look at where I think the future of this technology is headed, and where we can capture next generation value with the next generation sequencing and technology that's coming in on the beef industry. I'm going to give you the obligate slide of the industry structure in the particular country that I'm working in. And so the US beef cattle industry has around about 30 million mother cows. There's about 750,000 producers. And the average herd size is a little bit larger than here, which was 17 cows, as I understand from this morning's talk. It's about 122. But having said that, a very large number of producers in the US do have less than 50 cows, about 600,000. So there's quite a range there. And so, of course, there's a small number of seed stock producers at the top of the breeding triangle, and then a much larger number of commercial producers, and then perhaps a little bit different to the industry here, there's about 25 million cattle per year that are going through the feedlot industry. And so that's a very large and important industry in the US, and then of course they go on to the factory and the consumer. So there's a range of potential uses for DNA in beef production. It's not only for the improvement of accuracy of genetic predictions, which we've been talking a lot about here. It's also got some applications for parentage, recessive allele testing, control of inbreeding, mate selection, DNA-assisted management. And then if you look at this, the way I've got this drawn up here, basically only the seed stock and commercial sector are themselves producing animals, and then those animals go into the feedlot and processing sector. And so to me, what makes sense is to have the groups that are producing the animals be doing the DNA genotyping and then sharing those DNA information with the ones downstream, and I'll get back to that at the end of the talk. But there are a range of different applications, and my interest is what is the value of each of these applications. The first one, of course, is DNA-assisted selection. And in the US, we actually have started to implement genomically enhanced EPDs. There's two products that are on the market. There's a 50K product that's marketed by Pfizer Animal Genetics that's predictive of 13 different traits. And that's about $139 US for the producer to buy such a thing. And there's also a 384 SNP panel that's produced by iGenity. That's marketed around about $60. It's predictive of the 21 traits that are listed up there. And basically, the Angus Association is taking information from those two commercial companies on a weekly basis and incorporating it into their genetic evaluations. So they're taking performance data, pedigree data, DNA data if it's available, or genomic data if you like that term, and making these genomically enhanced EPDs. And basically what that information is doing is increasing the accuracy of those EPDs or MBVs, or EBVs, I think is the term that's used in Ireland, the genetic predictions that are coming from those animals. And where that's most important, of course, is in young animals, where you may not have any phenotypes or maybe just a birth weight phenotype, and you can get improved accuracy in things related to things like carcass traits that you wouldn't have any other measurements on otherwise. And that's really where the value of the genomic enhanced EPDs is coming in as a result of increasing the accuracy of those genetic predictions in those young animals. And so my question is, well, $139, $60, how much should I pay to increase the accuracy of my genetic value? And so I'm going to just discuss some work I did when I was on sabbatical in Australia with Mike Goddard and Julius van der Werf. And basically we were trying to estimate the value of improving the accuracy of our EBVs as a result of using genetic tests. And we basically modelled a large seed stock herd that was testing all of the male progeny that were born into that herd in a given year, and basically selecting the top 3% to be replacement stud males coming back into that seed stock herd, so the very elite, if you will, the best of the best. And then the remaining animals, the top 50%, were being sold as stock bulls into the commercial market, and then the bottom 50% were getting moved out of the breeding sector and not used for reproducing anything. And so basically we were comparing the improvement in accuracy we'd get from DNA testing and what would be the value of that. And so in order to do that, we had to have some sort of a financial basis to set this on, and I'd like to thank Arthur Rickards for setting me up very nicely in terms of discussing the indexes that exist in Australia, and we were basically using an index that's very analogous to the CAAB index that he discussed this morning, which has the profit drivers that are shown on the slide here. And I just will point out that I've kind of broken out some of these traits into green, which to me is where benefit is coming back to the actual cattle producer themselves. Things like calving ease and calving ease direct has a very direct influence on bottom line of actual producers. And of course, sale weight is a very big profit driver for producers. But down here in the blue is traits that actually derive benefit back to the processing sector, or the factory, if you will. And so you may or may not see that depending upon whether you still own the animal at the time that it's going through the processing plant. And so I just make that distinction because it becomes important in a minute. So this was the index that we were basing our accelerated genetic merit improvements on. And basically what we did was we modelled two tests, one that was very high accuracy and one that was intermediate accuracy. And I won't go into the details other than to say the very high accuracy one was set to the heritability of all the traits in the objective and all the traits in the selection criteria. So for example, for birth weight, the high accuracy test explained 39% of the genetic variation associated with that particular trait. And again, you can see here, these are basically the criteria, the data that's collected by breed plan. You can see that there's some that are associated with producer traits. There's some here that are going to be predictive of carcass traits. But there's a lot of criteria that we don't have, a lot of traits we don't have selection criteria for at the moment. Things like feed efficiency, feedlot performance, feedlot health. And those are the traits that genomics is meant to be going to provide a great deal of value for. But at the moment, they're not part of our economic indexes because we really have no way to get a measurement that's predictive of how good those animals are going to be for those traits. But this is basically how we set our tests up. So high accuracy, low accuracy. And basically the value of improving the selection response for stud bulls when using the high accuracy tests and the intermediate accuracy tests was very, very high on a per bull basis. And that's because those stud bulls have many hundreds, if not thousands, of genetic descendants, and so the value, every increase in dollar index is spread over a very large number of animals, and so there's a tremendous value associated with those very valuable bulls. As distinct from the commercial or the stock bull, where you typically got a bull that's maybe only going to be exposed to 100 females, let's just say for 25 females to one male over 4 years. It's a much lesser value, but it's still a reasonably high value when you have these very accurate DNA tests. And so what does this actually mean? It's an increase of 340 and 574. And on that particular slide, I tried to kind of contrast what's going on here. So if you had no performance recording at all, your bull would be at 0. But if you have the performance recording that's typically done as part of the breed plan process, then the rate of genetic gain that you get as a result of the improved accuracy associated with collecting all that data would bring the price of your bull up to about $340 or here. And if you then further increase the accuracy by adding that DNA test, then basically you're getting another $340 worth of improved accuracy and consequently increased rate of genetic gain with the intermediate test versus the high accuracy test. And I just want to draw attention to your fact that a lot of the value that's coming back from genetic improvement in this particular index is in blue, which means that the value is getting derived at the processor level. And so if you're selling your animals at maybe auction and you're not actually deriving a lot of that benefit, there's not a tremendous amount of improvement that's coming directly back to the producer. And DNA tests tend to really help traits that are related to the processing level because they do a good job at predicting traits for which you have no phenotypes, and typically you don't know carcass weight and saleable meat percentage on a newly born calf. And so there's a lot of value, and if that value isn't getting shared back with the person investing in the DNA test, then it makes the whole thing a little bit dodgy from an economic standpoint because you're not getting rewarded for where the genetic gain's occurring. So one of the questions that I was interested in is, well, do bull buyers actually pay for increased dollar index? So if you're going to put all this money into improving the dollar index, will the bull buyers actually respond to that? This last slide is just showing, I showed those two previous slides were on a per bull basis, but you had to test your entire calf crop of males in order to derive that value. And so you need to actually divide it by 2 or a larger number in the case of the seed stock bulls. And so the actual cost per test or value derived back per test is less than the value per bull. But these are fairly substantial numbers. So there is some value associated with using DNA testing to improve accuracy of selection. So are bull buyers willing to pay more for high indexing bulls? And basically when I was down in Australia last year, had a look at 6 different bull sales where we had bulls that had dollar index values, and I just had a look at the relationship between how much producers were paying for those bulls versus dollar index. And if there was a relationship, I'd expect there to be some sort of a slope there. And this is basically what the data showed. So a sale price is there on the y-axis and the index value is on the x-axis. And what you'll see is there's some real outlier bulls up here that are getting tremendous sorts of money. This is a $91,000 bull. He was going into AI, and of course AI, you can spread the genetic merit across tens of thousands of animals, so much more valuable proposition. So I took out those outliers, but you will notice that there is a positive correlation even with those outliers in there, and the regression was about 0.14. But then I just had a look at these particular ones and broke it down by different studs. And I know this is a busy slide, but I think the important thing to note here is that when they're in the northern sales, and this is northern New South Wales, these bulls tended to be going to commercial operators or stock bulls. And you'll notice that the slope in those northern sales is a lot less than in the southern sales, which are this purple and orange one over here, where you have a lot steeper slope. They're paying a lot more for every dollar of index. They're paying about $164 in bull price. And that's because a lot of these bulls tend to be going to the multiplier herds, where they're actually producing more bulls that are then going out into the stock sector. And so the good news here is that, yes, bull buyers are rewarding producers for improving their dollar index, and so there is a reward coming back to the breeder for accelerating the rate of genetic gain through improved accuracy. So that's one use of DNA. Another use of DNA is, of course, identifying genetic recessives, and there's been a lot of activity in this regard, particularly in the Angus breeds in the US and Australia. I give an example here of a particular recessive genetic condition that became obvious in 2008, and there was a genetic test developed late in that year, and there's a tremendous amount of money has been spent on dealing with this. So in the 11 months following the release of this particular test, there was about 96 6,000 odd tests done in the US, and if you figure that's at about $25 per test, this is obviously testing to see if an animal is a recessive carrier of this recessive condition. That's about $2.4 million that was spent in that 11 months looking for this recessive condition. And those, obviously, they would be testing cattle that had the animal that had the original mutation in its pedigree. Of those, about 20% were found to be carriers, and although this $2.4 million is a high amount, it's a lot less than these 80% of animals that were shown not to be carrying that genetic recessive condition that could then continue on in the breed and be used without concern with regards to that particular lethal being a problem. And if you just ballpark the value of those bulls and heifers, that's a lot of seed stock that was shown to be free of this particular condition as a result of that testing. And since that time, if you look, there's been a couple of other defects, and this was a slide that I prepared in May of last year. There's been over, in Australia and USA combined, over $8 million worth of testing that's been done for genetic conditions over the last 3 or so years. So tremendous money is getting spent to do these genetic condition testing. Now, while I don't discount the fact that it's important to get those recessive taken care of, I think sometimes there's been a bit of an overemphasis on it. And so Julius van der Werf and I did a little bit of a break-even cost of DNA testing and found that it's really dependent upon the frequency of that recessive allele in the population as to whether it makes sense to go ahead and do these relatively expensive genetic tests. And basically what's shown on this slide is a range of recessive allele frequencies here, and basically we modelled if you had 1,000 cow herd and you were buying in young bulls and you were going to test all of those bulls with a test, what test value would be break even relative to not testing those bulls and risking having one come in and be in your herd for 20 years and cause some dead calves as a result of that recessive condition. And you'll notice here this in the yellow is what the break even cost of the test is, and until that recessive allele frequency gets up to about 0.04, that's when the break-even cost of that test on those young bulls is about $23. So if it's a very, very, very rare allele, it's actually it's quite a low value associated with that genetic testing. If it's known that it's a carrier bull, which case I'm not sure why you'd be testing it, but if it is, then the value goes up quite significantly. But I just put that up there because I think that sometimes there's a lot of money gets spent on testing, and it really needs to be looked at from the perspective of gene frequency. So to sum it up, at the moment we've got this very strange situation where we've actually got producers who might be taking a DNA sample to send off for parentage testing with microsatellites at one lab, then they might be sending a DNA test off to another lab to get a genomic prediction, and then they might be taking a DNA test to send off to get parentage verification for breed registration. And it just doesn't make any sense to be spending $200 an animal and extracting DNA 3 times to get those 3 different pieces of information. And at the current time, I believe that the costs of DNA extraction and genomic analysis tends to exceed the value that's derived in any one sector. And so I'm going to take you on a bit of a wild ride now as to what I think the future might look like. And to me, extracting DNA multiple times in different labs for different applications makes about as much sense as simultaneously paying to have access to all of those communication devices when one would suffice for your needs depending upon what your needs might happen to be. I'm going to continue this crazy analogy and say that I think in the future there's going to be new genotyping platforms and technologies that will mean a single DNA sample can be assayed for multiple purposes, be it you're interested in parentage or genetic defects or genetic merit or traceability or whatever. And we're starting to see that coming out of GeneSeq, for example. There's a product that's being sold in the US that's the LD7K chip plus product that can do genomic imputation. So for genetic prediction, it can do genetic defects, it can do parentage, and it can actually do imputation from microsatellite-based parentage over using SNPs. So we can go back in historical breed records and confirm the correct pedigree information. And so I think that's what's coming up on the horizon, and I think what's happening is we're having a revolution in 2 things happening at once. We're having a dramatic decrease in the cost of the genome, and we're having all sorts of technologies that are developing. And I think the iPhone's a classic example of how quickly this is moving. And basically, I think there's going to be an intersection with next generation sequencing and next generation technology coming together to make this thing a lot more affordable and start actually delivering what I call next generation value to the DNA testing industry. And there's two challenges associated with getting that done. The first is a technological challenge, and that is we need to get the phenotypes on all animals and make that genotype available to all sectors. So as I said before, this is kind of a relative value of what I consider the different sectors might derive from genomics. But only these sectors are producing the new animals. And so somehow we need to get these sectors genotyping and then share that information with the downstream sectors. And this next slide is maybe thinking about things a little bit, going back to my cell phone analogy, and this is kind of where I see things headed. So the different sectors, we've got the very top of the AI bulls, then we go down to the seed stock, multiplier, registered females, and commercial cattle, and then there's a black line here because this is the only place that produces animals, okay? And we can have different levels of service, just as we have different levels of cellular communication devices for these different sectors, and there's different values associated with it, depending on how many descendants are coming from each of those particular animals. So we can perhaps afford to do full genome sequence on AI bulls. I don't think this number's totally out of line. It's $1,000 now, and it's dropping precipitously. Then maybe we do the 770 on the multiplier level. Then maybe a 50K genotype with parentage and recessives on the stock bulls. And then maybe we get down to a $10 test that does imputation, the LD chip, along with parentage and single gene traits and recessives for $10. And then these guys, they just need access to the data. They don't need to genotype again. That doesn't make any sense. And so they need some sort of a pay-as-you-go contract or some way to get into that data even when they need it. So I think all of this, and I think Ireland's got a situation that maybe can bring all this together, because all of it really hinges on that animal having a unique identification number that can match up to that genotype, and then we can make that information available. And the other thing is a structural challenge, and this is particularly so, I think, in the US, where many cattle operations have fewer than 100 head, and almost all of them sell their cattle prior to feedlot entry. So they're not retaining ownership, so they're not getting any of the value back from improvements in carcass merit. And if down the line we start developing genomic tests for feedlot health or feed efficiency or that type of thing, there's a break. They sell their cattle, they never see any value derived from making genetic improvement in these traits that benefit the whole industry, but they're downstream of where these particular producers are selling their product. And so if we're going to actually incentivize this, there needs to be some way that the breeders and the producers are getting some sort of payback for putting selection pressure on traits that don't directly benefit them. And maybe it's a bonus, maybe it's some sort of a vertical integration such that there can be the tie back. But to me, it all requires a structural challenge. And I'm going to steal a picture here from the speaker two after me, Peter Parnell, who I think really kind of summarised this very nicely with kind of the breeding triangle I had up on my first slide, but then it comes back through this kind of consolidation at the processor or the factory level. And really the genomics value proposition goes up here, but what's broken at the moment is the price signals and the performance recording for these traits that are of importance to feedlots and processors is not coming back to the seed stock producers and the commercial producers that are making the selection decisions. And for widespread adoption of this technology, I think the breeders are going to have to be adequately rewarded for making DNA investments and selection decisions based on these traits that benefit the industry sectors that are downstream of their particular sales. So my concluding thought then is that I think breeds and groups, and I might argue, having watched this morning's presentation, that Ireland's certainly headed this way structurally in terms of collecting all of the data they need to make this thing tick, but technologically is going to be the tricky thing, and getting, to me, for it to take off and to go over the tipping point of widespread industry adoption, the cost of genotyping for those large numbers of commercial cattle has to come down, and I don't know if $10 is the right number, but I'm pretty sure $50 is too much, and so less than $10 will be nice, and then they have to be able to share that with those downstream sectors, the genotype information, in order for the technology to become widely implemented across the whole industry. And thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation and I'm happy to take questions, or maybe not.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Alison. I've seen angry birds, but I haven't seen angry cows before. So just one brief question, and we'll leave questions until all the presentations are finished. But clearly genomics has massive potential for beef. We have every animal in Ireland with that unique ID. How long till we have genomics at that affordable price that you're talking about, that we can actually see our, I suppose, seed stock breeders starting to use it right across the board to start rapidly extorting some of the benefits that are there? To
me, it's a little bit of a chicken and an egg situation, and I think that for widespread adoption, the companies that are providing the platform of sequencing, whatever that may be, maybe it's Illumina, maybe it's another platform, they have to see that they're going to have the millions of samples before they're going to lower that price point to the $10 level. And until it gets to the $10 level, you're not going to have the millions adopting it. So it's a little bit chicken and egg. And so I would argue that the way that it needs to get done is there needs to be a very successful model on a small scale that shows that this can work and it does have legs, and that it could actually have utility for all the sectors of the beef industry. And maybe Ireland is the country to get that done.
Okay, thanks very much, Alison.